The notification came at 11:42 on a Wednesday morning. A name I didn't recognize. A message that was supposed to shatter me. By the time I finished reading it, I had already filed the incorporation papers, transferred the IP assets, and forwarded 6 months of financial records to the Law Society of Ontario. My husband's card was declined at the hotel checkout the next morning. He called me 4 times. I didn't answer once. I want to tell you how I got there. 14 years ago, I married the most ambitious man I had ever met in a city full of ambitious men. We were both articling students at a mid-sized firm in downtown Toronto, burning through 16-hour days on opposite ends of the same open office floor. He was magnetic in the way that certain people are the kind of person a room tilts toward without anyone deciding to tilt. I was quieter, more methodical, the one the senior partners actually trusted with their billing codes and client correspondence. But when he turned that attention on me, I felt chosen in a way I hadn't anticipated and didn't question. We got married in a small ceremony in Prince Edward County, my parents driving up from Kingston, his family flying in from Vancouver. The vineyard we chose was technically beyond our budget. He insisted. He always insisted on the version of things that looked best from the outside. The plan, as we discussed it over bad coffee in our Leslieville apartment, was straightforward. We would both continue practicing for 3 years, save aggressively, then launch our own boutique firm. Collaborative. Equal. Built on both our names. That was the plan. What actually happened was that I became pregnant 18 months into our marriage, earlier than we'd intended, and the calculation shifted. He was on the cusp of a significant file, a pharmaceutical liability case that the partners were watching closely. It made more sense, we agreed, for me to step back. Temporarily, he would build the profile, I would manage everything else, and when the time was right, we would revisit the partnership structure. The time was never right. Our daughter arrived in February, small and red-faced and perfect, during the worst ice storm the city had seen in a decade. My husband missed the first 6 hours of her life because his flight from a client meeting in Calgary was delayed. He arrived with flowers and a practiced look of devastated helplessness that I somehow found endearing at the time. I told myself that was the last sacrifice. Then I told myself that again, and again, and again, for the next 12 years. I am a corporate lawyer by training. Before I stepped back, I had already developed a specific expertise in intellectual property tech startup agreements, licensing structures, the particular architecture of how ideas become assets. When we launched the firm, Hartwell Legal, it was supposed to carry both our names. He convinced me, gently and reasonably, that his name had more market recognition at that point. Hartwell was his mother's maiden name. My name appeared nowhere on the letterhead. Nowhere on the website, nowhere in the firm's public identity. What my name did appear on was every internal document that actually mattered. I had designed the entire client intake system, built the file management protocols, negotiated the office lease on King Street West, and set up the firm's trust accounts with RBC. I remained the authorized signing officer on every account because, in the beginning, he genuinely needed me to be. As the firm grew, he hired staff to replace the functions I performed. First a legal assistant, then a full-time bookkeeper, then a junior associate. Each time someone new came on, I trained them. Each time, I maintained my administrative access because no one thought to remove it, and I never reminded anyone that I had it. Our daughter started high school. Our son, born 3 years after her, started middle school. I had built a life that looked, from the outside, like contentment. A detached house in Rosedale, a weekly farmer's market habit, a loose involvement in the firm through what my husband described to colleagues as keeping her hand in. I was introduced at client dinners as his wife, occasionally with an addendum about my legal background, always in the past tense. The first thing I noticed was a change in his schedule. He had always worked late. That was not new. What was new was the quality of his unavailability, the slight delay before answering texts, the phone placed face down on the kitchen counter with a casualness that felt performed, the weekend trips to Ottawa and Calgary that generated no invoices I could find in the system. I am a lawyer. I noticed these things the way I would notice an inconsistency in a contract. Not with panic. With attention. The second thing I noticed was a charge on our joint visa for a hotel on Bloor Street. We live 20 minutes from Bloor Street. There was no conference that weekend. I checked the firm calendar, which I still had access to through an administrative account I had set up 7 years earlier and never been removed from. I said nothing. I started a spreadsheet. Over the following 6 weeks, I documented everything. Cash withdrawals from his personal account, not joint, but one I had visibility into through the firm's bookkeeping access, in amounts small enough to avoid automatic flags but large enough, in aggregate, to suggest a parallel financial life. A charge from a jeweler on Queen West that produced no item I could find in our home. Restaurant bills for 2 at places he had never mentioned visiting. A recurring transfer to an account I didn't recognize, labeled in his notes as Consulting Meridian. There was no Meridian file at the firm. I did not confront him. I had learned, through years of litigation, that the moment you reveal what you know, you lose the advantage of knowing it. I kept the spreadsheet on a laptop I purchased with cash from a Best Buy in Scarborough and stored at my friend's apartment in the annex. A woman I had known since law school who understood, without me saying much, that I was building a case. The third thing happened on a Tuesday morning in early November when I was driving our son to his orthodontist appointment on Street Clare. My phone buzzed in the cup holder with a message request from an account I didn't recognize. The preview showed 4 words before I put it face down. "He's done with you." I took our son to his appointment. I sat in the waiting room reading a year-old copy of Maclean's and feeling, with remarkable clarity, that I had approximately 3 weeks before whatever was coming arrived. I drove home. I made tea. Then I opened the message. Her name was Renata. Her profile photo showed a woman in her early 30s, dark hair, confident expression, standing in front of what looked like a condo balcony overlooking the lake. She had sent 8 photographs. I recognized the sheets in 2 of them, the guest bedroom at our Muskoka cottage, the one I had furnished and maintained for 11 years. Her message was thorough. She had clearly composed it with care, perhaps with the intention of being devastating. She told me he was planning to leave. She told me he had been setting money aside for 18 months. She told me he had promised her they would relocate to Vancouver, where his family was, where she had a job offer. She told me he was waiting until after the Meridian Capital pitch, a major client presentation his firm had been preparing for, the kind of account that would redefine Hartwell Legal's market position before making any moves. He wanted to land the client first, collect the resulting retainer, and then disappear cleanly. She had included, at the end, a screenshot of a text exchange in which he described me as a liability he had been managing for a decade. I read the message twice. Then I set my phone on the counter, walked to the window, and looked out at the backyard where the sugar maple we planted the year our daughter was born had gone fully red for autumn. I allowed myself to feel it, the full weight of it. The particular grief of discovering that the person who called you his partner thought of you as a problem to be solved. I stood at that window for a long time. Then I went to work. The Meridian Capital pitch was in 11 days. I knew the file because I had, at my husband's request 3 months earlier, reviewed an early draft of the pitch deck for structural clarity. He had described it as just doing him a favor. In doing him that favor, I had also noted that the lead contact at Meridian was a woman named Sandra Okafor, whose professional history I had looked up out of habit, and who sat on the board of a legal industry association where I knew 2 people well. I called neither of them that day. I filed that information away and focused on the more immediate architecture. The first call I made was to a corporate lawyer in Mississauga, someone I had articled with, someone my husband had never met, someone who owed me a favor from a referral I had sent her 5 years earlier. I told her I needed to move quickly on something and that I needed absolute discretion. She told me to come in the next morning. The second call was to my own bank, a personal account at Scotiabank that my husband had no knowledge of, which I had opened 4 years earlier when I began to feel, not consciously, but somewhere below conscious thought, that I needed a room of my own in the financial architecture of our marriage. The balance was modest. It was enough. That evening, my husband came home and told me the Meridian pitch was coming together well. He was animated, the way he always was before something big. He asked about dinner. I had made pasta. We ate at the kitchen table while our son talked about a history project and our daughter was on her phone and everything looked exactly like what it had looked like for 14 years. I watched him across the table and thought, you have no idea. The following morning, I met with my lawyer. I walked her through everything: the spreadsheet, the photographs, the message from Renata, the Muskoka cottage registration, the firm's account structures, my administrative access, the nature of my original contributions to Hartwell Legal. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. "You're not just a spouse," she said. "You're a founding contributor with documented access and no formal exit or buyout agreement." "I know," I said. "That's a very different conversation than a standard divorce." "I know that too." We filed an application that afternoon to register my contributions to Hartwell Legal's IP portfolio, the client systems, the intake protocols, the proprietary workflow architecture I had designed under a numbered corporation in my name. The application was legitimate. The access was documented. There was nothing improper about any of it. I had simply never done it before because I had trusted that my contributions were understood. I had stopped trusting that several months ago. Over the next 9 days, I worked in parallel. On the surface, I was a Rosedale wife in November, making school lunches and attending a board meeting for a literacy organization I volunteered with and having dinner with a couple we had known for years. Underneath that surface, I was building the infrastructure of my exit with the same methodical precision I had once applied to his. I established full documentation of the firm's financial irregularities, the transfers to the Meridian account, which I now understood was not a client file but a holding account my husband had set up through a numbered company registered to a friend in Oakville. I found this through the firm's own records, which I accessed through my administrative login with complete legal authorization. I contacted the Law Society of Ontario's Complaints and Compliance Office. Not to file a formal complaint, not yet, but to ask, in general terms, about the reporting obligations when a lawyer becomes aware of potential misappropriation of client funds through a related party. The articling student who took my call was thorough and helpful. I also called Sandra Okafor's office. Not to interfere with the Meridian pitch. I simply introduced myself, former corporate IP lawyer, wife of the firm's principal, someone who had reviewed the early draft of the pitch deck, and asked if she would be willing to have a brief call before the presentation. "Professional courtesy," I said. She agreed. I told her nothing damaging in that call. I asked her 2 or 3 thoughtful questions about Meridian's IP needs, offered a perspective from my own practice background, and mentioned, in passing, that the firm was going through some internal restructuring. I kept my tone warm and neutral. But Sandra Okafor was a senior executive who had gotten where she was by reading between lines, and I trusted that she had heard what I was not quite saying. The night before the Meridian pitch, my husband brought home a bottle of Taw's Pinot Noir from the LCBO and suggested we open it. He was in an excellent mood. He praised our daughter's recent essay, listened to our son explain a video game with apparent interest, and later told me, in bed, that he was grateful for everything I had done to support the firm over the years. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed. I said thank you. I lay in the dark after he fell asleep and thought about everything I had set in motion, and whether I had any regrets about how I was handling it. I did not. The pitch was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon at the Meridian Capital offices on Bay Street. My husband had arranged a dinner that evening at Canoe, the restaurant on the 54th floor of the TD Tower, for himself, the 2 junior partners at the firm, and what he expected to be a celebratory table of Meridian executives. He had made the reservation 6 weeks earlier. He had told me about it as an example of his confidence. I had simply noted it. I was not at the pitch. I was at a coffee shop on Queen Street with my laptop, executing the final phase of what I had spent 11 days building. At 1:55 p.m., 5 minutes before the pitch began, I filed the formal documentation of my IP contributions with the appropriate corporate registry. The numbered corporation I had established was now the registered owner of the intake and workflow systems that Hartwell Legal had been operating on for 9 years. There was nothing fraudulent about this. The ownership had always been mine. I had simply formalized it. At 2:13 p.m., I sent a package of documents, the financial transfer records, the Meridian holding account registration, the correspondence I had recovered from the firm's shared drive to the Law Society of Ontario's Trust Account Compliance Office, along with a cover letter explaining my position as an authorized officer who had identified potential irregularities. At 3:15 p.m., I sent a separate, carefully worded note to each of the 2 junior partners at Hartwell Legal. Not accusatory. Not dramatic. Just, I've become aware of some financial matters involving the firm that I believe you'll want to review before tonight's dinner. I've forwarded relevant documents to your firm email addresses. Please review them at your earliest convenience. At 4:00 p.m., I called my husband's cell. It went to voicemail. I did not leave a message. At 4:47 p.m., the text came in, "What the hell did you do?" I put my phone in my bag and ordered another coffee. The dinner at Canoe did not go as planned. I learned the details over the following days, through the junior partners, through my lawyer, and through one rather extraordinary phone call from Sandra Okafor, who had developed what she described as serious reservations about Hartwell Legal's stability after the pitch and had decided, on reflection, that Meridian's legal work would go elsewhere. What happened at the table was that the junior partners had reviewed my documents during the cab ride to dinner. One of them had already forwarded them to the firm's external counsel. When my husband arrived at the restaurant expecting champagne and a signed letter of intent, he found instead 2 colleagues who were very carefully not making eye contact with him and a conversation that had none of the warmth he had anticipated. The call he made to access the Meridian holding account from the restaurant bathroom went unanswered because the account had been flagged by the bank pending a compliance review. His credit card was declined when he tried to cover the table's drinks. He called me from outside the restaurant, standing on Bay Street in the November cold. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that I will not repeat here, except to say that it confirmed, in his own voice and his own words, a number of things I had already known. The weeks that followed were not simple. I want to be honest about that. There is a version of this story in which everything resolves cleanly and quickly, in which the villain is punished and the wronged party walks away unscathed. That is not how it happened. Disentangling 14 years of shared financial and professional life is not a clean process regardless of who is at fault. The Law Society investigation took several months. My husband retained counsel immediately, and the process was adversarial and exhausting in the way that legal processes always are when both parties are lawyers. The junior partners cooperated fully with the compliance review. Several client files were audited. The irregularities my husband had introduced were real, though smaller in scope than I had initially feared. He had been preparing to move money rather than having yet moved it in significant amounts. That distinction mattered legally, and I am glad it was caught before it mattered more. Renata, for her part, had apparently expected a different outcome. When the Vancouver plan dissolved along with the financial architecture supporting it, so did she. My husband called me twice in the week after the dinner to tell me she had stopped responding to his messages. I found I had very little to say about this. Our divorce was filed in December. The property division negotiation was long and involved lawyers I respected on both sides and a mediator I had actually met at a conference in Ottawa in 2019. What I walked away with was the Rosedale house in the children's interest, primarily a structured buyout of my documented contributions to Hartwell Legal, and the full ownership of the IP corporation I had registered the afternoon of the Meridian pitch. What he walked away with was significantly less than he had planned for himself in that Muskoka notebook I had never told him I found. I want to say something about the children, because any version of this story that omits them is incomplete. Our daughter was 16 when this happened. She is perceptive in the way that teenage girls are perceptive, which is to say, completely. She had already sensed something wrong before I told her anything, had been processing it in the particular internal silence that she had always shared with me and not with her father. Our son was 13 and took it harder initially, in the external, angry way that 13-year-old boys take things. Both of them are, a year later, navigating it with more grace than I had any right to expect. I tell you this because the choices I made were not made in a vacuum. Every decision I made in those 11 days was made in full knowledge that I was also making it on behalf of 2 people who had not chosen any of this and would carry it regardless. In the spring, I opened a small consulting practice. Hartwell IP Advisory, the name a quiet reclamation. I work with tech startups and small firms on IP structuring, the exact work I had stepped back from 14 years earlier. My first 3 clients came through referrals from women I had met over the years at dinners and events and board meetings where I had been introduced as someone's wife, someone's +1, someone's support system. It turns out I had been building a network for years without recognizing that I was building one. My friend from the annex threw a small opening dinner at her apartment on a Thursday evening in April. 6 women around a table, good wine from a natural wine bar on Dundas. The kind of conversation that happens when people stop performing for an audience that isn't there. At some point in the evening, one of the women, a professor at U of T's Rotman School, asked me what I wished I had known earlier. I thought about it for a moment. Keep your own accounts, I said. Not as a statement of distrust, but as a statement of identity. Know what you have contributed, document it, and never let anyone's narrative about your role replace your own. Skills do not expire. Access does not have to be surrendered. And the most dangerous thing is not the person who undermines you, it is the habit of believing you need their version of the story to know your own worth. There was a moment of quiet around the table that felt, to me, like recognition. On the day I signed the lease for my consulting office, a modest space in a converted building near Trinity Bellwoods, with a window that looks out onto the street, I stood in the empty room for a long time. The walls were bare. There was a smell of fresh paint. Outside, a streetcar went by on Queen Street, that familiar sound of the city doing what cities do regardless of what any individual life is going through. I thought about the woman who had stood at a kitchen window 11 months earlier and felt the floor going out from under her. I thought about what it had taken to walk from that window to my laptop to the decisions that followed. Not bravery, exactly. Something quieter than bravery. The same stubbornness that had made me good at my work before I was someone's wife, before I was someone's support structure. Before I became the invisible architecture of someone else's ambition. My name is on the door. It is the only name on the door. I have no interest in telling you this story is easy or that the ending is tidy, because it isn't either of those things. What I can tell you is that the morning I received that message from Renata, I had a choice about what kind of woman I was going to be in the hours that followed. I chose the one I had always actually been, the one who built things, who documented things, who paid attention, who did not panic, who understood that the best leverage is the one your opponent doesn't know you have. I chose her. And she was more than enough.